Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, Thus Says the Lord, God Speaks Through His Servants, the Prophets. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 6 of our study, which covers the book of the Prophet Obadiah. For this lesson, we move into a book that perhaps many of you are not overwhelmingly familiar with. I know I wasn't. I may have been able to tell you if I heard the name that it is actually a book in the Bible. I may not have. We see it's very short, and thematically, in the Psalms, there are occasional places or big sections of, please God, get my enemies. But there are also, all these other things as well that are much more comfort and solace and, broad range of human emotion. Here in the midst of our journey through the prophets, for the sake of completeness, we have to look at the book of Obadiah. And it's not really a have to. It's a good thing that we're taking the time to look at it. But you'll note, as we go through it, it really does have, it's the shortest book in the Old Testament. It really does have one central and very clear theme that is very much get them. And where this gets interesting and important, as the lesson introduces and describes, is why what the Edomites did was so offensive. And so we will get into that. Well, we'll get into it right now, and we'll keep going through it as we go through the book. There is an ancient relationship between Edom and Israel, in that the founders of those two nations, Esau, the founder of Edom, and Jacob, the founder of Israel, were brothers. Twin brothers, and so there is that connection. As you read this, though, and the author is basically making that point, like me, you might be thinking, well, so what, right? How much thicker than water is blood over dozens of generations, right? It's not like it's not like we're cousins still, right? First or second or 30th cousins. There's a long divergence here for predating the people of Israel existing, or going to Egypt, or coming back from Egypt, or all the years of the United Kingdom and all the years of the divided kingdom. That is a lot of years. So is it really fair, from the author's point of view, that the Edomites should recognize and honor this bond of kinship? And maybe it's not, but there's another aspect to that bond that is what's truly offensive, that I think is worth bringing out, which is, so Esau, the founder of and the father of the Edomites, and Jacob were sons together of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. So these people not only share kinship, but they share worship of the same God. So there's a religious and a faith component here. The Edomites might not be Israelites. And the whole history of the development of the people of Israel with their God is the Edomites are separate from. But they nonetheless, as a part of their heritage, worship and serve the same God that the Israelites do. And this author and this book and the history of the people of Israel see a religious reason for the deportation, for the Babylonian captivity. And so some of the charges that we see leveled against the Edomites highlight that these people were complicit in and even participated in turning against the Israelites, and they should be aligned from a religious point of view, if nothing else, with the Israelites, such that turning against them isn't just turning against kin, but you can see it as a form of turning against God and your roots. And that's where this is worth talking about. What are the bonds that hold us, that are sacred, that should be inviolable, that should create principles that we will not turn against? And what creates and enforces those bonds is kind of, I think, the key question that this book calls us to look at, and the one we'll look at as we go through it. And I think the short version is maybe kin isn't it, but maybe God is. Many of us have had family members that come down on the wrong side of many things with us, and it can be a healthier thing to potentially cut off or separate from members of our family, as unfortunate as that can be. And hopefully most of you have never had to experience that, but I know that it does happen. And that is, and maybe it should, right? Family is not in and of itself that inviolable thing, right? We can choose to no longer treat someone as a member of our family, and while it's sad when that happens, it is not breaking a sacred bond that can never be broken. Some people might see it that way, and that might be where some of those weird familial pressures and relationships come from, but it's a thing that is okay under some circumstances to separate ourselves from. Whereas our bond and our relationship with and our allegiance to our God and to the people, other people who serve and worship that God, is not breakable. Right? As Christians, there is no circumstance in which we can get away with treating other Christians as other from us, period. Even, I might, on these videos, every once in a while, make a little jab at some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, just because every once in a while the opportunity is just sitting right out there. But at the end of the day, right, one holy Catholic church, an apostolic church, right, one. We don't see there being multiple Christianities. There's a single one, and everybody within that is our brother and sister. And that is the family that it's not okay to accept division in. Even if there is some division, that's fundamentally not okay. And we have to treat those Protestant brothers and sisters of ours as much as our kin as we treat fellow Catholics. It's one unified thing, as are the people, and it's because of our relationship with God. And that's the thing here that the Edomites violated, is they likewise were sort of a different sect maybe than the Israelites were. But they were united in being people serving, in theory, that one God. And so by turning against that, they turned against kin that is made kin by a deeper bond and connection than genetics or blood. It's one made by faith and by a covenant, by circumcision, right? All descendants of Abraham are theoretically are circumcised. And so that was given to Abraham. So they exist under one covenant, as we exist as Christians, under one covenant. And so you don't get to treat those things as separate. And so when they turned from against the Israelites, right, they were basically making politics and convenience more important than that bond. And that angered the author of this book, given the name Obadiah. Historically, don't know who wrote it. There's, in the Jewish tradition, there's talk and speculation about, this guy maybe was an Edomite who converted to be fully entered, becoming an Israelite and God's people, and converted, and was especially then offended at what his former kin were doing. None of that do we know for sure, right? What we know within the context of the book about who Obadiah is, basically nothing. And it ultimately doesn't matter. What we do know is he is very angry about what the Edomites did, and expects that God is as well, right? Again, he's a prophet. So this is not just a guy who's frustrated and is writing a hate letter, "Dear Edomites, you shouldn't have done that, God's going to get you," right? It's not just an angry, ranting email at these people who he feels didn't act right. This is a prophet. He is channeling the voice of God when he is saying this. And in doing so, he is teaching us an important thing about, again, all the stuff we just talked about this bond created by our covenant with God being deeper and more significant than any other bond. And God caring about that. And God does care about that. And when then you as the Edomites go against that, you are effectively cutting yourself off from God. And as the Israelites who cut themselves off from God had this temporary and very severe negative fate as a result of that, the Edomites subject themselves to the same because of how they respond to the Israelites when they're doing it, which is the ultimate message. They basically sign themselves up for similar when they don't help the Israelites. So we're going to go through some of the specifics of the book, and kind of trace a little bit of the development. But that's a high-level theme, what the book is about, what it means, why it's important, and probably the rest of the pass-through here will be relatively quick compared to that. We'll come back to some of those themes and look at how they play out. But that is our journey that we're about to take through the book of Obadiah. So as we've set up, this is the prophet's envy of the prophet, God's venting against this inappropriate action by the people of Edom. So what's going to happen to them as a result of that? They were feeling, as this passage tells us, they were feeling comfortable and secure, right? People don't often backstab from a state of feeling completely exposed and vulnerable themselves, right? You usually try to, that's the whole point of the backstabbing part of backstabbing, is you feel comfortable and safe from that non-threatening position, non-threatened position to backstab, which is kind of the accusation here. And the idea is they're a little ways away geographically from where all of this is happening. They're in a pretty fortified area, and they're decently powerful for the region. So they seem to think that the troubles that are happening up north a bit are not going to come their way, and especially no retribution from the Israelites, who are going to lose. So they seem to think that they're very safe in a mild to moderate amount of backstabbing. And so here is the prophet saying, you can think you're safe, but yes, you're safe from the Israelites, but remember, the person you're betraying is not Israel, it's God. And where are you going to be safe from that? You think you're secure because you have fortified areas and you're removed from this conflict, but the thing you've turned against is God. And he doesn't really, you're not really very protected from that. So was that a good idea? Is kind of the question here. And again, when we turn against our Christian brothers and sisters, there are times we might think that we have gotten away with something. But the offense to those joined with us in the same covenant is an offense not just against those people, but against the God who ratifies the covenant. and there's no getting away safely from that, right? So that's, before I mentioned how we treat our Protestant brothers and sisters, the same holds true of how we treat any Christians in need, right? When we have poor or struggling or suffering Christian brothers and sisters and we turn our back on that, that's just as bad. The call is to treat all people joined with us in this covenant as family, as like us, and not keep our distance and keep that comfortable separation and say that's their problem, right? And I think, again, there's some, the Edomites went farther than just looking up north and saying, I'd hate to be them right now, that's their problem. They, as we'll see, actively participated a little bit in helping it be their problem, which is even worse. But even just standing by is not very good either. So the offense is not just against the offended human party, but with God overseeing the covenant, the offense is also against God. So, the human party might actually get, deported and not be able to pay you back for your offense, but God can and God will. Building on the point here, there are really two things here. The first one is a matter of degree. They're, kind of normal in terms of what's going to happen to Edom. Kind of normal robbing and treachery has limits, right? Normal retribution, if thieves came and stole, they might, leave some things behind. The things that aren't valuable enough to be worth stealing, and even people picking your crops, there'd be some gleanings left for you. Not so much if God is the one who has his mind on righting the wrong. So this is not going to be a fun retribution, is the first point. And the second one is, again, you might think you're secure because you have allies, friends, and they'll come to your aid. The irony of that, when their crime is turning on kin to then trust in relationships to save them, is, of course, it's apparent. And again, God's point is, nobody, just like you weren't willing to stick your necks out for anybody else, nobody else is going to stick their necks out for you either. So you can't trust in your friends, and this is going to be more than your everyday plundering. This is going to be to an extreme degree, because again, like Almighty, all-powerful God is the one that you have gone against, and when his wrath is kindled, there are no limits to his wrath. And so, not such a great thing to look forward to. Now we get to the pretty obvious part of God's wrath that is clearly coming, all the murder. Your people, especially, the wiser and more valuable to your culture and society people, are definitely going to be killed when all of this happens. Pretty predictable, but when you're listing all of the bad things that are going to happen, it's definitely one to put on the list. And those are the people who the leaders who condoned how the Edomites act, bring upon themselves more culpability than the people who just go along with it. We saw the same with the Israelites, right? We saw the people in charge treated worse than the people not in charge. With great power comes great responsibility, right? And if you don't exercise that power well, you are responsible for having not used it well. Authority is ultimately from God. And so when God is, when there's a reckoning, it will first and foremost deal with those who had that authority and misused it. So that's pretty obvious, but it's very worth stating that there's going to be some death as a part of this, and not just destruction of property or loss of autonomy. There is loss of life involved as well. And the secondary, again, part of this is they're going to be cut off. We've talked about this with other sections. It's a very important theme throughout the prophets and any covenantal relationship with God and how we look at it. God never cuts us off. We cut us off. But once we do so, we can be cut off, right? We can be cut out of the covenant that we have made with God by our actions and attitudes. And the Edomites now, by this action, are cut off. They refuse to honor the bonds of the covenant, and so they are not bound by it. Again, a thing that also happens for us. If we refuse to honor the terms of our own covenant with God, then we can be unbound from it. But there's all the upside that goes along with being a part of that covenant that is then lost. It's not just, oh, I can do whatever I want now, and I will still be saved and enjoy the protection, safety, and prosperity that comes from God. No, if I turn my back on the stuff I have to do and am bound to as part of it, I also cut myself off from all of the benefits that come from the covenant. And so the people of Edom have cut themselves off when they turned their back on the Israelites. Again, not because of the bonds of family, but because of the bonds with God. The Edomites said, that's not important, and we're not going to concern ourselves with it. And so God said, okay, you're just like all the other nations now, and you acted unjustly against my people, so you will be treated as all the other nations who badly treat my people, which is to say, again, the loss of property, loss of autonomy, loss of life, etc. We've pretty well laid the foundation for this part already. What is the exact charge against the Edomites? We'll see two. This is the first one. They stood by and didn't do anything. And we'll see even potentially gloated a little bit. So first and foremost, what did they do wrong? They set themselves separate from or apart from the Israelites and were willing to stand by and watch bad things happen to the Israelites without intervening. This text implies that alone is sufficient to merit God's displeasure here. We'll see they did potentially take it even a bit farther in that, which is worth talking about as well. But that one thing, just standing by, is going to be sufficient here to incur God's displeasure. As we're listing charges, not only do we get a more detailed list of the willingness of the Edomites to stand idly by, but we see that they were not just standing by and laughing and gloating, but they did actively participate as well, which is the second main component of the charge. It looks like they engaged both in looting and in catching people who were trying to get away to safety and turning them over, which is certainly not a good thing to do. So there we see it. They stood idly by. They enjoyed and gloated over the fate of their kin. They participated in looting, and they caught people trying to get away and handed them over. Not such a great list of things to do, and you can see why the Israelites and God were potentially unhappy with, not potentially, were actually unhappy with that behavior, and why it leads to negative consequences for the Edomites from God. So we've laid out the charges. What happens? The very predictable, God's going to get you. Interestingly here, and very significant to other things that come up in other writings of the prophets, and we've addressed before and will address again, this point of reckoning where God pays the Edomites their due is described as the day of the Lord. Not to be confused with the Lord's Day. Right? Every week we have the Lord's Day, which is a holy, restful, and unitive experience in our relationship with God. So the Lord's Day is, our Sabbath, our day to enjoy union with, peace, rest with God. And that's, positive, uplifting, creates a relationship. By contrast, this day of the Lord that comes up seems to nearly universally involve some kind of reckoning, and maybe is not the day that you want to spend with God. Sunday, Sabbath, Lord's Day, that's a day you want to be spending with God, and that is an enjoyable and a celebratory experience. The day of the Lord, same words, is the one you want to be absent from. You would prefer that not occur with you present. And it's not just here with the Edomites that it happens, right? It occurs, we see talk of this with throughout the prophets, and it's not something that any of us won't experience either. Again, it is that reckoning. If you are an Edomite, it's a reckoning you don't want because you have turned against your union and your call with God. The interesting point is, if you are living according to the covenant that you made with God, these two slightly different phrasings of something become the same thing. Your encounter with God becomes what the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, is. It becomes, you have fulfilled your part of your obligation toward God. And when God comes and you meet God, that is a restful, joyous, and celebratory event. Even if there is also, your reckoning is good, right? There is a way to pass the test. And if you do, then your ultimate meeting with God is something to look forward to and to be glad for. So the two versions of that phrasing are actually really are fundamentally talking about the same thing. When we meet God, what happens? The difference is, how are we predisposed to do so? Are we ready to meet God? And it is interesting that you see a couple of different iterations or flavors of the implication of what that event holds, depending on context. Because again, most of the time when the prophets are talking about it, they're doing so in a context of warning, in a context of, you have stepped outside of bounds, and while you're outside of bounds, you should be fearing meeting God. But if you just step, they're saying it not, hey, we want to punish you, but to say, hey, but if you step back in bounds, then that wouldn't be something you had to worry about. And you'd be all good. So, step back in bounds. In this particular case, maybe it's less, we're not really inviting the Edomites to step back in bounds here. Right? They missed their chance. God is open to forgiving everyone, and we can all be forgiven. But the Edomites at this particular time are kind of past the immediate point of redemption. They have cut themselves off from the covenant. They probably can't go on being in covenant with God as Edomites at this point. They could go all in and convert, like tradition says the author of the book of Obadiah did, and join the Israelites, and they could still find their way back. But this state they were living in, where they weren't God's people, but they were religiously aligned with God's people, that's kind of gone. They showed that that's not really a thing, and we're not doing that anymore. It seems to be God's message here. So you can either go all in with me, or you can decide you're against me. And either one of those options we can work with. So what's going to happen? From the immediate vantage point of when this prophecy is coming, the Israelites look to have already been punished and to be in a very bad spot. The Edomites are still in a good spot. The message here is that's not how it's going to end. the Edomites are going to be wiped out, and it turns out God is still with the Israelites, so there is a remnant that is fine, and God's people will once again rebuild and flourish, and Israel will be restored, and then some, whereas Edom is wiped out. Again, highlighting the covenant that you have with God is more important than anything else going on. It might seem like what's going on in the world is entirely against and totally wiping out the work that God's trying to do. And it might seem very tempting to change teams at that point, and to side with the team that looks like it's going to win, which is what the Edomites did. The trick is there you are betting against God, and that the text tells us isn't going to work out well for the Edomites, which we know is accurate historically, and it doesn't work out well for us ultimately either. Betting against God is probably a pretty silly idea, and I suspect if we thought about some of the things we're doing that way, like, yeah, I'm siding with society on this one because it's so much easier to fit in and get along, that's maybe a thing we can sort of justify. But then if you take it to the next step of, I am sort of betting that God's way isn't ultimately going to flourish and thrive here, and that instead we'll kind of normalize toward what society thinks is the thing to do, you don't bet against God like that, right? You're assuming that God is going to change his mind and his position, and have your divergence become more okay. And that is not, nor has it ever been, how God works. And so you're not you, particular person watching this, I'm thinking more in terms of me, and I'm saying you. When we do that, we align ourselves somewhat against God, right? And if that goes far enough, then we end up acting against God and God's people, and again, violating the covenant that we have entered into, and cutting ourselves off. So be very careful about thinking, you can kind of subtly move away from and normalize being against God and assume that that's going to be okay because that's how things are working, and that seems to be the prevailing or the conquering point of view. Because maybe it doesn't win in the end, and then you're the one who picked the wrong side. And that doesn't end well, as we see. Here we sort of complete the last thing we need to talk about on our checklist of what's going to happen to the Edomites. We saw for the Israelites that the Babylonians came in and took over their land. Here we see who it is matters less than, hey, any area or territory that you think is yours is also going to get seized by those around you. So again, the things you lose, most importantly, your lives, also your property, definitely your autonomy, and even your land. It's everything. You lose everything. You cut yourself off from God, you lose everything. And finally, then, not only Edomites do you lose everything, but ultimately what happens, anybody who is left over ends up serving God, whether they wanted to or not, but as subjects instead of as kin. Ultimately, Mount rule will come from Mount Zion and from the restored Israel, and now you are no longer friends with or aligned to them. You will be in God's kingdom, whether you want to or not, but your position is much less favorable now than it would have been if you had made a slightly different decision. And again, that holds for all of us, right? Ultimately, no person can choose not to be ruled by God in some capacity, right? We can't exempt ourselves from God's rule and God's judgment. We don't get to say, I'm choosing not to be subject to death and consequences for my sins. Right? We just are subject to God's rule. We can be subject to the unpleasant version of it or the pleasant version of it, depending on whether we submit, but we do not get to choose to not be ruled by God. We just are. It is a reality of human existence that we are all under God's kingdom and under God's rule, whether we are obedient subjects or not. The same ends up being true for the Edomites. They are under and within the kingdom of God, ultimately, even when they acted against that and tried to act like they are not, which is really a fascinating point, and one worthy of reflection for all of us. There's nothing we can do to separate ourselves from being ruled by God. All we can do is choose the nature of that relationship by whether we obey or not. That's the choice we're given. And I think too often we treat it like we can choose not to be subject to God, which is false. We don't have that power or that choice. But we can choose to be obedient or not. And I think it probably helps us decide how to proceed if we are aware of truly what choice we have and what choice we don't have. Right? It makes a whole lot more sense to obey if we know we can't stop being subject. Where we get into trouble is if we think we can choose to not be subject and can go any way we want to without consequence. But that just ends badly because we're trying to make a choice that is not in our power to make. So the ultimate point of the whole book is it's definitely way better to obey God and the obligations that come with that, and to receive the rewards that come with that. And if we choose not to, bad things do happen. This has been an overview of Lesson 6 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.